The year is 1826. A storm moves like a slow serpent across the Shenandoah Valley. Rain lashes down on old wood. Inside a candlelit study, a patriarch, Lucian Graver, writes with a trembling hand. He's not leaving a will. He's leaving a confession, one that would never reach the world. He wrote, "They offered us everything. Land, immunity, influence. All we had to do was hand over the child." That was the last time anyone saw the Graver family. No bodies, no blood, no explanation, just silence and a house that stood empty for 64 years, rotting from the inside out as if it were ashamed to speak. But here's what you're not supposed to know. The Gravens weren't just one family. They were the first domino. Between 1820 and 1890, across Virginia, a strange pattern took shape. Entire bloodlines of rural elite families disappeared from public record. Not murdered, not bankrupted, not emigrated. Vanished. No police reports, no obituaries, no graves, but whispers, always whispers, about secret meetings in the Blue Ridge Mountains, about gentlemen from the capital arriving in black carriages with no insignia, about children being chosen, and others being corrected. Most dismissed it all as folklore, as if history itself conspired to bury these ghosts. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't myth, it was design. Families were being erased to protect a lineage of power far older and far darker than America itself. Men with names we still worship, systems we still obey, symbols that still stare from our currency, our government buildings, and our screens. And all of it began with the erasure of the Graver name. They didn't vanish. They were sacrificed. For what? That's what we're going to unearth tonight. But I warn you, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This is not a story, it's initiation. And this is just the beginning. Stay sharp. What you're about to hear has been buried for a reason. The attic of the Graver estate was sealed with rusted nails. 27 of them. Not 25. Not 30. Exactly 27. According to occult numerology, 27 signifies completion of a dark cycle. The authorities who eventually forced entry claimed to find nothing but dust and mice. But one man, Deputy Alphonse Mercer, never signed the official report, because what he found was a ledger, bound in red leather, lined with names. Not just the Gravens, but the Addingtons, the Drelms, the Farrow clan, the entire Chatham line. Each name was followed by a symbol and a date. The dates always preceded the disappearances. And the symbols, ancient, pre-Masonic, but familiar to those who've studied the esoteric roots of American architecture, matched the geometric engravings found beneath the Capitol Rotunda in Richmond. Patterns no one ever explained, designs never taught in any official record. Mercer showed the ledger to a state official. 2 days later, he was declared mentally unfit, institutionalized, and within months, presumed dead from self-inflicted drowning. In a dry holding cell, the ledger vanished, or so they believed. But it was copied, by hand, in secret, and decades later, one of those copies landed in the hands of a man named Elias Crowe, a war veteran turned theological archivist, who cross-referenced those dates with church excommunications, tax anomalies, land seizures, and unofficial census drops. The pattern was undeniable. Every 11 years, 3 months, and 9 days a purge, bloodlines removed, children unaccounted for, property absorbed by private trusts, often administered by firms that never existed before and never existed after. This was no coincidence. It was a cleansing, a way to erase any line that posed a threat to what Elias called the rooted order. A centuries-old pact of powerful men and women preserving a singular bloodline whose name is never spoken, only invoked by cipher. But there's more. The ledger didn't just predict vanishings, it dictated them. Elias believed it was a divine contract, a reverse Torah, used by a covert council of American founders who had secretly split from Europe's Enlightenment, choosing instead an older path, a darker path. And those symbols, they weren't decoration, they were instructions, ritual blueprints disguised as genealogical records. You weren't just removed from history if your name was marked in red, you were offered body, soul, and legacy. To what we're getting closer now? Do you feel it? The descent has begun. Elias Crowe didn't stop at names. He went back to the ruins of the Graver estate, not to search the house above, but what lay beneath. Locals had long whispered about tunnels, hollow echoes under the orchard, soft soil that swallowed dogs, strange sounds that rose at dusk, moans that didn't belong to anything alive. Crowe found the entrance behind a collapsed hearthstone in the root cellar. What he discovered changed the course of his life, and ended it just 8 days later. A staircase of black shale led 52 steps down. At the bottom, he found a sealed wooden door scorched with 7 burn marks. He pried it open. Inside, a circular chamber, stone walls carved with symbols in a language older than Latin, A dais in the center, shackles bolted to the floor, and a mirror that didn't reflect anything, except your eyes. It was a place of ritual, not for worship, but for extraction. He called it the house beneath the house. There were no candles, no altars, no idols, only tools, hooks, leather restraints, a ledger of names identical to the one upstairs, but written in a different hand and soaked with what appeared to be human oil. Crow's final journal entries were brief, manic. He wrote of hearing whispers in reverse, of a humming in the walls, of seeing a woman in a dress made of veils, who stood motionless just beyond the reach of his lantern. He wrote, "This isn't a place for memory. It's a place to unmake it." 8 days later, his body was found hanging from a tree that hadn't stood for 50 years. A sapling grew from his open mouth. The ledger and journal, gone. Except for one torn page mailed anonymously to a man named Dr. Victor Hale, a psychologist specializing in post-traumatic identity fractures. That page contained a map, not of a tunnel system, but of heritage fractures, points across Virginia where families split. Not through migration, through rewriting. Families weren't just erased, they were recoded, given new names, new records, a new history, and then sent back into society, loyal not to their kin, but to something ancient, something fed through ritual and silence. These people walk among us now. You've shaken their hand, you've voted for them, you may have even loved one, and now we descend deeper. They called it the doctrine of the hollow blood, a philosophy, a practice, a control mechanism disguised as an inheritance, buried within private sermons from 1832, uncovered in the charred ruins of St. Enoch's Chapel, found behind a false altar, was a parchment written in ciphered Latin and Appalachian gloss, a blend of old-world priesthood and frontier folklore. On it, the passage that would haunt every scholar who dared translate it: the body is a vessel, the name is a chain. Break the blood, and the soul flows upward into the will. They believed bloodlines carried more than genetics, they carried loyalty, resistance, memory, and for their order to thrive, to truly take root, they had to hollow that out, not kill, not conquer, rewrite. And so they developed a method. Children under 9 were removed, first from families, then from language. They were isolated, starved of their names, their customs, their histories. Their memories were overwritten through shock, repetition, and ritual. They were not adopted, they were recoded, raised to believe they belonged to something more sacred than lineage, the will beneath the republic. They became watchers, sleepers. The ones who smile with dead eyes in photographs, the ones who never seem to age, who never speak of childhood, who inherit positions without merit, loyalty without question, and wealth that never runs out. You've seen them, in boardrooms, in pulpits, in war cabinets, in Ivy League halls, each one bearing a new name, but none chosen by them, only assigned, and their purpose, to maintain the spell, to keep the hollow blood doctrine intact, because if even one of them remembers, the whole illusion fractures. Dr. Victor Hale spent 20 years interviewing descendants of these, or coded, families. Most refused to speak. Some couldn't, but one, identified only as Subject A, said 5 words before biting off his own tongue. The blood wasn't hollow enough. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a warning. There are still fractures in the system. Cracks where truth leaks out. That's why they're watching videos like this. Monitoring keywords. Flagging bloodlines, trying to reconnect with their real past. Because truth isn't just dangerous, it's contagious. And you, yes you, have already been exposed. Now ask yourself, was your history given, or implanted? In 1844, in a remote bend of the Shenandoah Woods, there stood a village known only to a select few, Crimson Parish. It never appeared on official maps, not because it didn't exist, but because those who visited it either disappeared or returned altered. The village was said to be founded by 7 families, all of whom had vanished from Virginia records within a span of 5 years. Not through war, not through disease. Through redirection, they were marked in the ledger, relocated, assigned new names stripped of pasts, and settled in a place where no lineage mattered, only obedience. At the center of Crimson Parish was a schoolhouse. But it wasn't a place of learning. It was a place of unlearning. Children were taken there under the guise of religious study. But what occurred behind those stone walls had nothing to do with salvation. The doctrine taught in Crimson Parish was not Christian. It borrowed the symbols of the church, the cross, the altar, the hymns, but twisted them into an ancient cipher, each lesson designed not to inform, but to fracture. Rituals were performed where the children were made to chant phrases in forgotten tongues, phonetic permutations of Akkadian, Phoenician, and early Druidic dialects, not random, not gibberish activations keys. Dr. Hale, yes, the same Hale who held the torn ledger page, Obtained audio recordings in 1981 from a surviving phonograph cylinder labeled CP13. The voice is unmistakably a child's, but the words, no modern linguist has translated them. Except one phrase, repeated 12 times, return me to the hollow where names fall away. These weren't prayers. They were erasures. By the age of 10, the children no longer responded to their birth names. They had no concept of mother or father, no history before the parish. Only duty to something called the core. The core was never defined, but always capitalized, and one boy, No, as they called him, escaped. He walked 17 miles barefoot through wilderness to a ranger's outpost in Staunton. Malnourished, covered in old bruises, barely spoke, but he said one thing before collapsing. They told us our parents were never real. Noah died 2 days later, internal hemorrhaging. His file was sealed, and Crimson Parish, burned to the ground, no arson report, no news coverage, only a line in a private land trust document, Parcel 77 cleared for reclamation. But the children, they didn't all die. Some became core, some are still smiling, still watching. Now tell me, who taught you how to think? In 1853, a man named Silas Vexley arrived in Richmond claiming to be a cartographer, an expert in mapping the unseen territories of both land and mind. He had no official credentials, yet was immediately commissioned by private interests to survey properties that no longer existed. Vexley didn't use a compass. He used pendulums, made of bone, and when asked what he was mapping, he replied, the fractures, the memory wounds. Historians called him insane. But those who studied his surviving charts, hidden for decades behind layers of paint in the walls of the Mayhurst estate, discovered something horrifying. He wasn't mapping geography. He was mapping trauma. Across Virginia and into parts of North Carolina and Maryland, Vexley's maps pinpointed clusters of forgotten towns, erased families, and psychological anomalies, each point marked not with coordinates, but with sigils. And at the center of every cluster, a structure, sometimes a chapel, sometimes a school, sometimes an orphanage, always government-funded, and always bearing a seal long since retired, a four-pointed star inside a broken circle, the insignia of the rooted order. Silas claimed these locations were anchors, psychic nodes where memory could be split, twisted, and rewritten. Not just for individuals, for entire bloodlines. He called it cognitive cartography, the idea that minds could be charted like rivers, redirected like water, and dammed when necessary. His most famous diagram, Map 14C, shows a convergence point beneath the James River, a place where 7 trauma lines intersect. He marked it with one word, throne, no explanation, no access. That area is now occupied by a federal intelligence annex. No official name, surrounded by black fencing. No fly zone. Not on civilian satellite maps, but more disturbing than the maps were Vexley's journals. He believed memory was not stored in the brain, but around it, in fields, in frequencies, and those who mastered this could extract and reprint consciousness. Sound like science fiction? The CIA didn't think so. Decades later, declassified documents would reference Vexley protocols in early MK-ULTRA experiments. His theories became their templates, and the trauma-inducing sites he mapped, they weren't shut down. They were repurposed, rebranded as schools, hospitals, rehab centers, still active, still functioning, and still mapping the minds of those who dare remember. You ever forget something you know you lived? Ever felt like a piece of you was erased? It wasn't an accident, it was charted. We go deeper still. They told the public it was a harvest ritual, a local celebration of fall bounty and ancestral pride, held every 11 years in a forgotten hollow near Black Hollow Ridge. But the locals knew better. They called it the Feast of the Nameless Saints. It began in 1855, continued into the 1890s, and perhaps never truly ended. No one outside the region was ever invited. There were no records, no posters, no journalists. Only word of mouth invitations passed through select bloodlines, always orally, never written. And attendance, mandatory for certain families, especially those who had been erased and recoded. Here's what little we know, pieced together from 4 surviving attendees, each of whom died within a year of telling their stories. The feast was held at dusk. Tables stretched the length of the woods. Candles lit from a central flame said to have never been extinguished since the founding of the parish. No one spoke for the first hour. Because the first hour was for them. Empty chairs lined the table, dozens of them. Each chair carved with a symbol, a date, and what looked like a human tooth embedded in the wood. And during that hour, according to survivor William Kirsch, you could hear them. Not ghosts, not spirits, but the voices of the rewritten, mothers who'd forgotten their children, sons who'd been renamed, men who remembered being born in one place but buried in another. One woman said she sat across from her original father, who did not speak, did not blink, but wept silently into his plate of nothing. Then came the meat. No one knew what it was. It was said to taste like veal, but with a sweetness that caused hallucinations. One man said he saw an orchard grow from the table. Another heard a choir of infants whispering his full name backward. This wasn't food, it was sacrament, an ingestible ritual engineered to weaken resistance, blur timelines, and reinforce submission to the core. You ate, you drank, you forgot. And if you didn't forget, they called you twice. Once to the feast, and once to the fire, because no one who remembered the truth ever left the feast unchanged. Or unmarked. One survivor woke up days later with a burned hand. No recollection of how, but beneath the skin, doctors found small metallic shards, arranged in the shape of a four-pointed star inside a broken circle. Sound familiar? That's the insignia again. They brand you when memory lingers. So tell me, have you ever dreamed of a dinner you don't remember attending? Good. That means we're getting close. Along the mist, heavy shores of Virginia's forgotten coast, now largely sealed off by federal wildlife easements and naval testing zones, stood a series of peculiar structures. Lighthouses, but not like the ones you know. Shorter, squatter, made of black stone that doesn't match any local quarry. And unlike traditional lighthouses that warn ships or guide them safely, these never shone seaward. Because they weren't meant to guide the living. They were meant to contain what lies beneath. Between 1822 and 1879, 5 of these towers were constructed quietly, each registered under a different private maritime trust. Their purpose? Seismic survey installations, according to the brief mentions in colonial infrastructure records. But the blueprints, if you can find them, show something far more sinister. Each tower contained 3 levels below ground. And at the very bottom, a sealed chamber marked EL. What's EL? Elias Crow, before his death, hypothesized it stood for ego locus, a containment term used by certain occult societies to indicate a storage point for fragmented consciousness. In other words, they weren't building lighthouses, they were building prisons. Not for people, not for bodies, but for memory, for identity, for fragments of truth too dangerous to be destroyed, yet too volatile to be left free. Imagine a truth so potent, so ancestral that it has to be locked underground. Not erased, just buried. Alive like a breathing wound in time. During one of Dr. Victor Hale's last interviews, a former groundskeeper for the Drowning Hill Tower, a lighthouse decommissioned after a mysterious sinkhole, admitted something chilling. He said, "It hums at night. The floor, it hums like it's remembering something. Like it wants to tell me where I came from." When asked what happened when he stood directly above the lowest chamber, he replied, "I wept, and I don't cry. But I wept because I saw my mother's eyes, only I never knew her." 2 weeks later, that groundskeeper vanished. The tower was imploded. The government claimed it was unsafe, but what they really feared wasn't collapse. It was awakening. Because when one tower falls, the others feel it, and the memories begin to leak. Memories of who we were before the hollowing, before the rewriting, before we agreed, through silence, to forget what we once guarded. You're beginning to see it now, aren't you? This isn't just about a few missing families. It's about the war on identity itself. And if you're still here, you're resisting. Now, halfway through this descent, I ask you to do something dangerous. Type this in the comments twice to mark your awakening. I was never meant to forget. Let the system flag it, let them watch. Because now they know you remember. In 1862, a linguist named Dr. Amsel Byron was hired under false pretenses to translate scrolls. Discovered. Beneath a chapel near Staunton. The scrolls weren't ancient, but they weren't recent either. The ink had no known compound. The language was not Latin, Greek, Hebrew, or any recognized script. But Byron noticed something horrifying. The words, if read aloud in sequence, didn't just translate ideas. They removed them. His assistant, after reading only 4 lines aloud during transcription, stopped speaking for 3 days. Not out of fear, because she'd forgotten how. Not just how to form the words, but the very concept of communication itself. Her mind had been scrubbed. Not by trauma, not by drugs, by phonetics. What Byron had discovered was later called mirror speech, a forbidden dialect said to originate from the early rites of pre-Atlantean blood cults. Its purpose wasn't to teach or to express. It was to unwrite. The scrolls were filled with phrases designed to fracture identity, to break memory into compartments, to separate thought from self, to dissolve heritage, and most disturbingly, they worked best on children under the age of 10. You think your language is a tool. But what if it's a cage? What if the wrong language could reset your blood, sever ancestral instinct, and implant a new invisible obedience. Byron kept translating, until one phrase spoken softly by mistake during dictation shattered every mirror in his home. He wrote in his journal, "I did not scream, but my reflection did." Later that night, he scratched a symbol into his own chest, a spiral inside a triangle traced in his own blood, and walked calmly into the freezing James River. They never recovered his body, but they did recover his mirror. Housed now in a sealed room in a private Yale collection, it's said that no matter how you enter the room, the reflection always appears facing away. A reflection that remembers something you've forgotten. Now ask yourself, why are certain ancient languages no longer taught? Why are some syllables outlawed in federal speech therapy guides? Why do certain dreams feel like a language you once knew? Because they've been rinsing the tongue for centuries. Not to protect us from the past, but to protect the past from us. You are not who you think you are. You are who they've taught you to be. If you travel far enough into the ruins of Dread Hollow, past the moss-choked gravestones and the foundations swallowed by ivy, you'll find a circle of 7 old stone wells. Locals call them the listening mouths. They're sealed now, chained with iron and concrete slabs bolted down by federal orders in 1947. But from 1830 to 1890, they were known as oracles. Not metaphorically, literally, because if you leaned in close enough, the wells didn't echo your voice, they spoke back. Not in words, in memories. Not yours, theirs. There was an order of men, the watchmen of the wells, sworn into silence and stationed to protect the site. Their job wasn't just to guard it from the public, it was to listen and record what the wells said. Over 3,000 entries were logged into a private book known as the Tome of the Echo, hidden for nearly a century before surfacing during an estate sale in Fredericksburg. The entries weren't predictions, they were confessions, spoken in fragments, in sobs, in voices of women and men who had never been born, or had been erased from birth records altogether. One phrase recurred again and again: the core must feed, or the circle breaks. And the circle, it wasn't just the arrangement of wells, it was the cycle of obedience. Every 11 years, like clockwork, someone was taken. Their name stripped from history, their blood catalogued, their memory rerouted into silence. The wells whispered what was lost, as if mourning the bones no one would ever dig up. And the watchmen? They didn't grow old. They withered, not from disease but from exposure. Their eyes grew foggy, their teeth fell out, their hair bleached white. Some went blind, others vanished. Those who lasted longest would begin to speak in voices that weren't their own, tones and accents that didn't match any region or era. One final note, scrawled by the last watchman before the order was disbanded: the wells don't just remember, they absorb. I no longer dream my dreams, I dream theirs. And what did the government do? They sealed them. Not because the wells were dangerous, but because the truth still echoes. And they knew one day someone like you would lean in far enough to listen. And if you do, you may never sleep the same again. Because some knowledge doesn't live in books. It waits underground, waiting to return. In 1871, deep in the folds of the Appalachian borderlands, time began to go missing. Not seconds. Not minutes, hours. Whole blocks of memory vanished from the minds of people living near a ridge once known as Ashevale Run. A name now scrubbed from maps, replaced by a string of meaningless numeric designations. The residents didn't speak of it. They couldn't. Because the missing hours weren't forgotten. They were taken. By whom? By what the locals whispered about only once a year, around dying fires and behind locked doors. They called it the harvest. Unlike any seasonal festival or agrarian tradition, this harvest did not reap corn or wheat. It reaped consciousness. It happened on the 9th hour of the 9th night of the 9th cycle, every 9 years, 9 months, and 9 days. The bells would ring in the abandoned church with no bell ringer, dogs would howl without cause, and then silence, for hours, no wind, no birds, no footsteps. And when it returned, no one remembered anything. No one except Cassian Vale. He was 12 the night of the last harvest in 1871. Hidden beneath the church floorboards by a father who'd stopped trusting the sky. Cassian didn't see, listened. And what he heard was not human. He wrote, voices, high and low, all speaking names. Names not spoken in generations. Some names weren't even words, just feelings wrapped in syllables. And then the door, not opened, not kicked in, but peeled back, like skin. Cassian ran. He emerged 2 days later, eyes blackened, nails shredded, unable to speak above a whisper for 6 months. But when he did, he revealed a list, 7 pages long, names of every man, woman, and child who'd vanished over the last century across Virginia. And every name matched entries from the original Hollow Blood ledger. How did he know? He didn't. They told him. The voices from the harvest, Those voices didn't belong to demons or spirits, or even the dead. They belonged to us, to our past selves, harvested, stored, and reconditioned through time. You ever feel like something's missing? Not just lost keys, but lost you. A version of you that once knew more, trusted less, refused obedience. That part of you wasn't killed. It was harvested. For them. For the core. And unless we finish this descent, they'll come for what's left. It was called the Wainscott Institute, opened in 1868 under the guise of an academy for exceptional children. The institute sat perched on the edge of a wooded plateau in Grayson County, funded quietly by a coalition of industrialists and private senators. It boasted cutting-edge pedagogical techniques and identity refinement studies. But there was one strange fact that no one could explain. Not a single student ever graduated, not in the 2 decades it operated. No class photos, no diplomas, no reunions, just names, handwritten in rosters that grew longer each year, then suddenly stopped in 1889. The building still stands, rotting in the woods, padlocked behind triple-layer fencing owned by a silent Delaware trust. Locals won't go near it, not even for money. Because what happened inside wasn't education. It was reconstruction. The children sent to Wainscott weren't just orphans. They weren't poor. They weren't forgotten. They were selected. From the hollow bloodlines, each one handpicked by bloodline monitors embedded in churches, courtrooms, and courthouses across Virginia. Their parents were told they had gifted children, offered generous scholarships and lifelong benefits. Most never saw their children again. Dr. Victor Hale reviewed over 2,000 pages of classified records recovered from a failed Senate oversight request in 1976. The children weren't taught reading, writing, or math. They were taught obedient memory. Memory without anchors. Lessons included reciting family trees with randomized surnames, practicing emotional dissociation from the faces of loved ones, and worst of all, time reversal exercises. These exercises forced students to write false diaries of lives they never lived, until the imagined life overwrote the real one. A former groundskeeper, on his deathbed, confessed to seeing a classroom of 24 students sitting in silence, each drawing a picture of a face with no features. When asked what they were doing, one child whispered, "Creating the version of me that cannot rebel." The Institute didn't just erase children's pasts. It built shells, hollowed vessels pre-programmed for service. Where are those children now? Scattered, quiet, successful, obedient, some in politics, some in media, some in positions of influence where you think they represent you. But they don't. They represent the core, and they've forgotten they ever belonged to anything else. You still believe your memories are your own? Look again. Who gave you the first image of your past? A parent or a system? On May 4, 1885, at exactly 3:33 p.m., something happened over the valley of Black Hollow that no historian dares to explain. The sun dimmed, not eclipsed, not clouded. It dimmed as if the sky itself had blinked. Every clock stopped for 13 seconds. Every compass spun. Birds fell from the air mid-flight, and for 13 full seconds, no shadow was cast. It was called the stillness. No storm followed. No earthquake, just silence, and then screams. Witness accounts describe people collapsing into seizures, eyes rolled back, speaking in dead languages. A farmer named Joshua Griggs scrawled a single phrase into the dirt before dying of neurological rupture. The mirror cracked inward. Across town, a young girl named Elsie Brent was found wandering, barefoot and shaking, clutching a book no one had ever seen before, a leather-bound volume with no text, only blank, pulsing pages. Every priest, scientist, and librarian who touched it either went mad or disappeared within months. But the book didn't vanish. It was sealed in the vault of St. Halley's Parish, a subterranean catacomb beneath a church that no longer appears on registries. 2 men were assigned to guard it. Both were former instructors from the Wainscott Institute. Both took vows of silence. Both died exactly 13 years later, same day, same time. You're beginning to see the pattern, aren't you? Cycles? Rituals? Memory? Not as recollection, but as weapon. What happened on that day in 1885 was not random. It was not natural. It was a glitch in their machinery, a moment when the veil slipped. When the system that feeds on hollowed minds and recoded names failed to reapply the mask fast enough. And for a brief moment, the original you looked back. Not the version they engineered, not the citizen, not the consumer, but the ancestral sovereign, the one born before the programming. One of the final written accounts comes from the journal of a gravedigger named Luther Menz, who buried 19 unmarked bodies that week. His final entry reads, "Their mouths were open. All of them, but not in terror, in revelation. As if they had remembered the first name, the one before all names. You were never meant to know that name. Because to speak it undoes the rewrite. And that's why they've burned every record. Because even one spark of true memory can set the whole illusion on fire. Shall we ignite it further? There is a name, unspoken, unprinted, unwritten, not lost, hidden, buried like a time bomb beneath centuries of manufactured identity. A name that does not belong to one person, but to all of us. Before the hollowing, before the core, before obedience was confused with peace. And those in power have done everything to erase it. Because that name is sovereign, it cannot be bought, it cannot be branded, it cannot be controlled. You were born with it, and then, without consent, it was stripped. The process was subtle, surgical. Your name was replaced with a sound that fits their ledger. A surname tied to property taxes, a first name designed for easy indexing, a legal identity, a product tag in human skin. But the original name, it echoes. Through dreams you forget the moment you wake. Through tears you can't explain. Through a fire in your gut that tells you something is wrong with this world, but can't quite say why. That's the memory trying to get back in. In 1889, a woman named Cicely Dre went silent for 9 months after the disappearance of her son, one of the last children taken to Wainscott Institute before its final purge. She didn't cry. She didn't sleep. She waited. And on the 270th day, she wrote one thing, over and over, on the walls of her home in blood and ash. His name was not his name. Neighbors thought she'd gone mad. But one archivist, Jonah Keller, found her journal years later buried beneath floorboards when the house was condemned. Inside were sketches of symbols, some matching ancient Sumerian glyphs, others echoing the same sigils found in Elias Crow's maps and the Ledger of Hollow Blood. And at the center a spiral, crossed by lightning. The mark of return. Jonah traced the glyphs to multiple sites across Virginia. He was forming a hypothesis that certain children at Wainscott were beginning to recover fragments of their original name. The core had failed to fully erase it. What happened next? Jonah disappeared, but not before mailing one last line to a contact in Boston. The true name is encoded in the wound. They scar us to distract us from the door underneath. A wound, a scar, a mark meant to silence, but instead, it whispers. Look at your life, the patterns, the pain, the missing years. Now ask yourself, who gave you your name? And who took the first one away? In the winter of 1890, the Virginia Postal Registry flagged an anomaly. Over 78 letters, addressed from across the state, all bound for a single recipient. Miss Abigail Varn of Hollow Pine, were intercepted marked undeliverable, and quietly burned by federal handlers. No official record remains of Miss Varn's residence. No census entry. No burial. Only one handwritten notation in the postal ledger. She sees too much? What were the letters about? Fragments survive. Charred edges. Melted wax scorch, scrawled words. But through reconstruction, one phrase repeats, the eyes are waking. Abigail Varn, an amateur naturalist and midwife, had no known political ties. But she did have one trait the core feared above all: she could see through the rewrite. She kept drawings, hundreds of them, tacked across her bedroom walls. Family portraits that didn't match any known records. Children holding hands with strangers that had been erased from history. Faces that seemed to flicker when lit by firelight, revealing another person beneath the skin. She claimed they followed her. Not people, eyes, unblinking. Ever present. Watching not from shadows, but from inside memory itself. Memory is a lens, she wrote, and someone has scratched glyphs into the glass. She began leaving messages in books at local libraries, tucked between pages of forgotten Bibles and legal dictionaries. You were rewritten. Ask your father if he remembers his grandfather's real name. Watch your own reflection when you speak aloud the first lie you were ever taught. She was sending codes, triggers, quiet detonations against the psychic programming seeded across generations. And that's when the eyes turned violent. She was last seen walking toward the banks of the Blackroot River. The ground was frozen solid, no footprints, no body, only a ring of melted snow. In the center, her final drawing: a child, eyes closed, mouth stitched, and beneath it, if you forget too well, they own your sight. Now here's the part they cannot explain. 6 months later, 47 people from Hollow Pine gouged out their own eyes. They claimed they could still see her. They claimed she was showing them the unwritten past. And they all said the same thing before being locked away. She's peeling back the mirror. Because mirrors aren't for vanity. They're for surveillance. Your screens. Your cameras. Your self-reflection. Every surface a portal. Every glance a scan. And every time you forget who you really are, they win. So ask yourself, have you ever felt watched? By something that doesn't blink. Good, it means you're waking up. In the summer of 1890, the last of the sealed vaults in Culpeper County was due to open. According to court records and private estate law, the Langridge Vault, a stone chamber beneath a crumbling plantation house, contained what was referred to as a heritage bind, a locked box meant for the descendants of a man known only as CFL. 3 families, Langridge, Mortain, and Hollowell, were summoned to the reading of the estate. Only 2 arrived, because the Hollowells vanished completely. No horses left the homestead, no footprints, no letters, just empty chairs, a hot meal still on the table, and a single line scratched into the wall of the nursery. We were never meant to receive. When the vault was finally opened, what they found wasn't gold, or deeds, or heirlooms. It was a black box, wrapped in hide, no seams, no keyhole, and a message carved into the lid in 13 ancient tongues. If opened without memory, it devours. The Mortains refused to touch it, but the Langridge heir, a man named Erasure, stepped forward. He placed his hand on the box, and screamed, not in pain, in recognition. "My name isn't mine," he shouted. "It was never mine. I was made to forget." He convulsed, cried in voices that were not his own. And for a brief moment, every candle in the estate flared blue. Then silence. The box had opened itself. Insignificant documents, just a fragment of glass, smooth, circular, like the lens of an eye. When Erasure looked through it, he collapsed, whispering something over and over again until his throat gave out. "They burned the first version of me and left this one behind." He died 1 week later. The official cause? Heart failure. But those who washed the body reported something strange. His fingerprints no longer matched any record. Not even his own. And that's the secret they've kept from you. Inheritance is not about money. It's about identity. You weren't robbed of wealth. You were robbed of your first self. Every man who should have inherited truth was given obedience instead. A different face, a different name, a different map to follow, and the real inheritance, it waits, still sealed, because it only opens for those who remember, who resist the programming long enough to reclaim what was stolen. Now ask yourself, when you look in the mirror, does the face staring back feel earned? Or does it feel assigned? Let's finish this. There's a chamber buried beneath the foothills of Monroe County, hidden inside what used to be a federal asylum before it was decommissioned in 1891 and quietly sold to a private trust known only by initials TAM. No one knows what TAM stands for, but the patients who lived and died inside the asylum called it the room that dreams. You won't find it on the blueprints. It exists between levels, hidden behind what appears to be a brick wall that's slightly too warm, even in winter. Those who found it, very few, describe it the same way: a perfect cube. 6 black walls, no windows, no lights, and yet you can see. Not because the room is lit, but because you begin to remember light that never existed. Inside, the air doesn't smell like dust or decay. It smells like your childhood, even if you don't remember it. Especially if you don't remember it. Because this room doesn't dream random things. It dreams you. Not as you are, but as you were before the edit. Before the rewriting. Before the core recoded your memories to serve a version of reality that was safe, profitable, and silent. Inside the room that dreams, survivors say time folds. Your heartbeat syncs with sounds that are not your own. Your hands feel heavier. You begin to speak in tongues you never studied. And then you see it, a memory you never lived, but always carried. A stone house. A woman without a face humming your name in a language made of bells. A circle of men with blank scrolls watching you sleep. And when you wake, you won't know what day it is, you'll just know what was taken. One man, an ex-CIA neuroprogrammer turned whistleblower, entered the room in 1972. His alias was Jericho Vale. When he emerged, he said only this: "They didn't erase our past. They rented it out, generation by generation, to feed the gods of forgetfulness." He vanished 4 days later. Not disappeared, reassigned, to a new life, a new name, a new self. And the room, still locked, still dreaming, still waiting for the one soul strong enough not to remember, but to hold what's remembered, because that's the final test. Not who you think you are, but who you refuse to forget. You've nearly reached the end. You made it. Most won't. Not because they're weak, but because they're still asleep, still pacified by the lullaby of assigned purpose, still hypnotized by the illusion that the story they were given is the story they chose. But you're still here, which means you're ready to meet the man with no echo. His name was never recorded, because he erased it himself. Before they could, he was born into one of the hollow bloodlines. Langridge, Mortain, or Hollowell, no one knows which, raised within the rewriting systems. Conditioned, groomed, tested. But something broke, not his mind, his obedience. They say at age 12, he stood in front of a mirror for 40 days. No food, no water, just a candle and a journal he filled with the names of his other selves. And on the 41st day, he stopped casting a reflection. No, not metaphorically. Literally. Photographs showed nothing. Mirrors went cold. Even surveillance footage flickered, pixelated, blurred, as if the system itself refused to acknowledge him. He became a ghost in the design. They called him the null echo, a glitch, a leak, a living virus inside the construct of inherited obedience. And then he began to awaken others. Not loudly, not publicly, whispers, sigils carved into train stations, symbols sewn into clothing, phrases slipped into sermons and newspapers. You are not who they told you are. The first name is buried beneath your birth certificate. Remember your reflection before it was assigned. One day, he walked into the Capitol building in Richmond with nothing but a folded page. On it, your face. Not physically, energetically, your pattern, your blood resonance, your forgotten lineage. He handed it to a guard and said, "The last one is waking up," then vanished. Never seen again. No arrest, no footage, no record. Only one file remains, classified until 2099. Inside, a phrase marked, "Contagious to the programmed." It reads, "He who remembers cannot be controlled." And now look at yourself. Not your face. Your presence? You made it to the end of a map not meant to be followed. You've stared into the black mirror. You've traced the threads of the core. You've tasted the hollowing. And still, you are here. So ask yourself the final question, not with words, ooh, but with will. What would happen if I truly remembered who I was before they told me? Because if you ever do, they lose, and you become unnameable, unfiled, and unbroken. Welcome back. Type it again below. I was never meant to forget. Twice. This time for the ones still asleep.